The Alpha King invited the rejected Omega as a joke, but he had no idea the woman who would walk through his doors was the rightful queen of everything he ruled. 3 months earlier, a servant girl had fled from the most powerful Alpha in the Starling Kingdom when the mate bond snapped between them in his private chambers. She'd dropped a silver tea tray, shattered porcelain across marble floors, and disappeared into the servant corridors before he could speak her name. He thought she rejected him because he was weak. He thought she found the bond repulsive. So he did the only thing his wounded pride would allow. He severed it, signed the rejection papers in a private ceremony, and spent 3 months slowly unraveling while she scrubbed floors and pretended her wolf wasn't howling in grief. Neither of them knew the truth. She wasn't just a servant. She was the daughter of the late Queen Regent, hidden since birth by advisors too terrified of civil war to crown an infant girl. She'd been raised in kitchens and laundries, taught to make herself invisible, trained to survive by never being seen. And when her mate found her anyway, when his wolf recognized hers despite every attempt to hide, she ran because she'd learned that survival meant staying small. But invisibility has limits. When the king's steward convinced him to send that invitation, to parade the servant who rejected him in front of noble families, to prove he'd moved on, to let her watch him choose a mate worthy of his throne, something inside her finally broke. She opened the chest her protector had kept hidden for 24 years. She lifted her mother's moonstone tiara, and she made a choice that would shatter a kingdom. She would go to that ball. Not as a servant, not as the invisible girl who fled from love because she thought herself unworthy, but as the queen she was born to be. To understand how a woman raised in shadows became the goddess who stopped a king's heart, we need to go back to the beginning, to the night. A palace burned with the scent of lavender and wild roses, and 2 fated mates collided in the dark. The palace woke before dawn, and Isla woke with it. She moved through the servants' wing in the dark, her bare feet silent on cold stone. The other maids were still sleeping in their narrow bunks, their breathing soft and even. Isla dressed in the dim light filtering through the single window, the same rough gray dress she wore every day, the fabric thin from years of washing. She braided her dark hair tight against her skull, wound it into a knot at the base of her neck, and pinned it until not a single strand could escape. Invisible. That was the rule her mother had taught her before she died. Be useful. Be quiet. Never let them see you. Isla had been following that rule for 12 years. The kitchens were already alive with chaos when she arrived. Cook was shouting at a scullery maid who'd burned the morning bread. 2 kitchen boys were fighting over a cleaver. The head butler was pacing near the pantry, muttering about wine cellars and visiting dignitaries and impossible timelines. Isla slipped between them all like water, her presence so unremarkable that no one looked up when she entered. She went to work. By the time the sun rose over the palace walls, Isla had reorganized the disaster Cook had created with the evening's menu, reassigned 3 maids to cover gaps in the schedule, and prevented a full-scale rebellion among the scullery staff by quietly moving the burned bread to the servants' breakfast and pulling fresh loaves from the ovary backup stores. No one thanked her. No one noticed. That was exactly how she needed it. Through the high kitchen windows, Isla caught glimpses of the palace courtyard. Nobles in silk and velvet crossed the stones on their way to morning court. Visiting alphas arrived with their entourages, their wolves prowling just beneath their skin, their dominance rolling off them in waves that made the kitchen staff flinch. And at the center of it all, visible through the arched entrance to the throne room, was the king. Alpha King Kalen. Isla's hands stilled on the copper pot she was scrubbing. He stood at the head of the great hall, his shoulders rigid beneath the weight of formal robes, his face carefully blank as he listened to some complaint from a visiting lord. Even from this distance, Isla could see the exhaustion in the set of his jaw. He looked older than his 26 years, alone, despite the crowd of nobles surrounding him. Her wolf stirred beneath her ribs, a faint, drowsy awareness that she'd learned to suppress years ago. Isla looked away and returned to her work. She had no business watching kings, You. The voice cut through the kitchen noise like a blade. Isla turned. Garrett, the head steward, stood in the doorway with his hands clasped behind his back. His silver hair was slicked into perfect order, his dark robes immaculate. His pale eyes swept over her with the same expression he'd used to assess a broken chair, calculating whether she was worth the effort of repair. "The lavender stores are low," Isla said before he could speak. "I submitted a request 3 weeks ago to replenish them, but the order hasn't. I'm not here about lavender." Garrett's voice was silk over ice. "The visiting delegation from the Eastern Pax has requested specific accommodations. Their lady has taken ill. You'll prepare a calming tea and deliver it to the King's Wing." Isla's hands tightened on the pot. "The King's Wing? Do you have difficulty hearing, girl?" Garrett's smile was thin. "Lady Morgana is the King's guest. She's been given chambers in the private wing. You'll bring the tea there this evening before the state dinner. The housekeeper says you have some talent for herbal remedies. Don't embarrass us." Isla kept her eyes lowered. "Yes, sir." Garrett turned to leave, then paused. "And Isla, if I find you've been skimming supplies for personal use, there will be consequences. I'm watching you." He swept from the kitchen before she could respond. Isla's wolf growled low in her chest. Liar. Thief. The scent of deception clung to Garrett like smoke, but no one else seemed to notice. Or if they did, they were too afraid to speak. Marin, the head housekeeper, appeared at Isla's elbow the moment Garrett was gone. She was a thin woman in her 60s with iron gray hair and sharp green eyes that missed nothing. She'd been watching over Isla since the day she was born, though the other servants thought she simply favored the quiet girl who never caused trouble. "You'll be careful tonight," Marin said. It wasn't a question. Isla met her eyes. "I'm always careful. The King's Wing is not the kitchen's child. There are eyes everywhere, nobles who will notice a servant where she doesn't belong. And Garrett." Marin's mouth tightened. "Garrett is watching you more closely than you realize. He sees competence as a threat." Isla knew. She'd been deflecting Garrett's suspicion for years, making herself forgettable the moment he looked her way. But tonight, she would be walking into the private wing of the palace, the forbidden territory where she'd spent her entire life avoiding, the wing where the king lived. Her wolf shifted restlessly. Marin touched her wrist, just once, a brief pressure of calloused fingers. "Remember who you are." But that was the problem, wasn't it? Isla didn't know who she was. She was a servant. She was invisible. She was the girl her mother had raised to survive by never being seen. And tonight she would walk into the king's chambers carrying a silver tea tray, and she would pray that he didn't look at her too closely, that his wolf didn't catch her scent, that the secret sleeping in her blood stayed buried for one more night. The hours crawled past. Isla prepared the tea with hands that refused to shake. Chamomile, valerian root, a whisper of lavender to calm the visiting lady's nerves. She poured it into the palace's finest porcelain and arranged it on a silver tray with practiced precision. When the sun finally set and the state dinner began in the great hall below, Isla climbed the servants' stairs to the king's wing. The corridors here were different. Warmer, lit by oil lamps instead of tallow candles. The stone walls were hung with tapestries that depicted wolf hunts and ancient battles. The air smelled of pine and leather and something wilder, the scent of alpha power that soaked into the very walls. Isla's pulse hammered in her throat. She found Lady Morgana's chambers and slipped inside. The visiting noblewoman was asleep, her breathing shallow and pained. Isla left the tea on the bedside table with a whispered instruction to the attending maid, then turned to leave. A door opened down the hall. Footsteps. Heavy, male. Coming closer. Isla's wolf went rigid. She pressed herself into an alcove, the tea tray clutched against her. Through the gap in the tapestry, she saw him. Alpha King Kalen. He walked past her hiding place with his head bowed and his formal jacket half unbuttoned, exhaustion radiating from every line of his body. His dark blonde hair fell into his eyes. His jaw was tight with the kind of tension that came from holding something too heavy for too long. He was alone, unguarded, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen him in the throne room. He stopped just outside his chambers and ran a hand through his hair. The gesture was so achingly human that Isla's chest tightened. Then he went still. His head turned slowly toward the alcove where she hid, and Isla realized, with a horror that turned her blood to ice, that he'd caught her scent. Isla pressed herself deeper into the alcove, willing her body to disappear into the stone wall. The king stood 5 paces away with his back to her, one hand on the doorframe of his chambers, utterly unaware of her presence. She could leave. She should leave. Lady Morgana's tea had been delivered, and there was no reason for Isla to linger in the private wing where servants like her didn't belong. She shifted her weight carefully, preparing to slip back toward the stairs. Then the king's shoulders dropped. A long, shuddering breath escaped him, and Isla froze. He looked so tired. The rigid control he wore in the throne room had crumbled the moment he thought himself alone. His dark blonde hair was disheveled, falling into his eyes as he braced himself against the door. His formal jacket hung open, half the buttons undone. Even from this distance, Isla could see the tension in his jaw, the weight pressing down on him. He was 26 years old, an ache she had no right to feel. The king pushed himself upright and stepped into his chambers. The door stayed open. Warm candlelight spilled into the corridor, carrying with it the scent of pine and old leather. Isla heard him move deeper into the room, heard the soft thud of boots being discarded, the creak of a chair accepting his weight. She should go now, while his back was turned, while she still could. But her feet wouldn't move. Through the open door, she caught a glimpse of the king's private sitting room. Books stacked on every surface. Maps spread across a low table. A cold fireplace that no one had bothered to light. It was the room of a man who spent his nights working instead of sleeping, who carried his kingdom alone because he had no one to share the burden. Isla's wolf stirred, a drowsy, confused awareness that she'd been suppressing for years. No, she couldn't afford this. Couldn't afford to see him as anything other than the untouchable king who ruled the palace she scrubbed clean. Couldn't afford to notice the exhaustion in his movements or the loneliness that clung to him like a second skin. She took a careful step backward. The floorboard beneath her foot creaked. The sound was soft, barely audible. But the king went rigid. Then he turned his head slowly toward the alcove, and Isla stopped breathing. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The king's pale gray-blue eyes swept the shadows where she hid, and Isla prayed to the moon goddess that he wouldn't look closely, that the darkness would keep her invisible just a little longer. But then something shifted in his expression. His nostrils flared, his eyes widened, and Isla realized with dawning horror that he'd caught her scent, lavender dust. The smell of her wolf, which had been dormant so long she'd almost forgotten it existed. It filled the corridor between them like a living thing, and the king inhaled sharply, his whole body going taut. His wolf slammed into his consciousness with a force that made him stagger. Isla saw it happen, saw the moment his careful control shattered, saw his pupils dilate and his breathing quicken and his hands curl into fists at his sides. Saw the raw recognition flash across his face before he could hide it. Métis.d. The word echoed through Isla. Her wolf surged upward from the depths where she'd been buried, suddenly, violently awake. The pull between them snapped into place like a rope pulled taut, and Isla gasped at the force of it. No, this couldn't be happening. This wasn't possible. The king spun to face her fully, his gray-blue eyes burning in the candlelight. He took a step forward, and then another, drawn toward her by a force he clearly didn't understand but couldn't resist. "You," he breathed, and his voice was rough, aching. "Where?" Isla stepped out of the alcove before she could stop herself. The bond pulled at her, demanding she move closer, demanding she answer the call in his eyes. Her wolf was howling inside her chest, pressing against her ribs, straining toward him with a desperation that terrified her. Mine, her wolf whispered. Ours. Safe. Home. But Isla knew better. She'd watched what happened to servant girls who caught the attention of powerful men. Her own mother had been one of them. Used, discarded, left to raise a bastard child in the shadows while the man who'd claimed her moved on to more appropriate partners. Isla had sworn never let herself be possessed by someone who saw her as a temporary diversion. And now her fated mate was the Alpha King himself, the cruelest joke the moon goddess had ever played. Kalen moved closer, his hand outstretched, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her skin burn. He moved like a man in a trance, pulled forward by something bigger than choice. I know you, he whispered, though they'd never spoken a word to each other in 6 years. I've been searching for you. I didn't know. I couldn't find. His wolf knew. Of course it did. The bond didn't care about rank or station or the impossible distance between a king and a servant. It only cared about the connection singing between them, bright and terrible and utterly inescapable. Isla's hands trembled. The tea tray shook in her grip. Kalen was close enough now that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes, could smell the scent of him, winter pine and something wilder, something that called to her wolf like a howl in the night. His hand reached for her face, gentle, reverent, and Isla saw her mother's face in her mind. Saw the way she'd died alone, forgotten, nothing but a cautionary tale whispered among the kitchen staff. Never let them see you, her mother had said, or they'll use you. Isla dropped the tea tray. Porcelain shattered across the marble floor in an explosion of sound. The king flinched, his hand jerking back, and Isla used that single moment of distraction to run. She bolted past him, her worn shoes slipping on the polished stone. Behind her, the king shouted something. A word that might have been her name, though he'd never learned it, though his wolf shouldn't know it. But Isla didn't stop. Couldn't stop. She fled through the corridors of the private wing, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her wolf screaming in protest with every step that took her farther from her mate. Tears blurred her vision. The bond pulled at her like a physical thing, trying to drag her back, but Isla ran harder. She knew these halls, knew every servant's passage and hidden stairway. She'd spent 6 years learning how to disappear, and now that knowledge was the only thing that would save her. The king's footsteps echoed behind her, faster than they should be, driven by a wolf that had finally found what it had been searching for and wouldn't let it escape. But Isla was smaller, quicker, and she knew where she was going. She ducked through a narrow door that led to the servants' stairs, slammed it behind her, and ran down into the darkness. Down and down, until the stone walls turned rough and the air grew cold, and the air grew cold and the scent of pine and winter finally, mercifully faded. She didn't stop until she reached the servants' wing. Until she was back in her tiny room with the door locked and her back pressed against the wood, her whole body shaking. Her wolf was howling. A sound of such anguish that Isla clapped her hands over her mouth to keep from echoing it aloud. The bond stretched between them like a wound, pulling, demanding, calling her back to the mate she'd just abandoned. Isla slid down the door and buried her face in her knees. She'd just run from her fated mate, from the Alpha King, from the one person in the entire kingdom who was supposed to be hers. And tomorrow, when he learned who she really was, when he discovered she was nothing but a servant girl with calloused hands and a dead mother's warnings, he would reject her properly, and the bond would break, and Isla would spend the rest of her life knowing exactly what she'd lost. Kalen didn't sleep that night. He paced his chambers until dawn, his wolf clawing at his chest, demanding he go after the girl who'd fled from him like he was a monster. But he couldn't chase her. Couldn't use his power to drag a terrified Omega back into his presence and force her to accept a bond she clearly didn't want. So he waited until first light, then summoned Garrett. The head steward arrived within minutes, his silver hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour. He took one look at Kaelin's face, and his expression shifted into something that might have been concern on a man capable of genuine emotion. "Your Majesty, you look unwell. Find her." Kaelin's voice was rough from hours of his wolf's howling. "The Omega servant who was in my wing last night. Find her and bring her to me. I need to speak with her." Garrett's pale eyes flickered with something Kaelin couldn't read. "May I ask what this concerns, Your Majesty?" "No." Kaelin turned away, his hands curling into fists. "Just find her. Please." The word came out broken, desperate. But Kaelin was past caring about dignity. His mate had run from him, and he needed to understand why. Needed to know what he'd done wrong. Needed to fix it before the bond between them withered from neglect and fear. Garrett bowed and left without another word. Across the palace, in the cramped servants' quarters, Isla woke to Marin's hand on her shoulder and a quiet command to stay in her room. "There's been an incident," Marin said, her green eyes sharp with warning. "The head steward is asking questions. He's looking for the girl who was in the king's wing last night. Until I know what this is about, you stay here. Do you understand?" Isla nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Her wolf was still whimpering, a sound of loss so profound it made her chest ache. She'd run from her mate. The bond was pulling at her even now, begging her to go back, to find him, to answer the call she'd ignored. But she couldn't. She wouldn't. Marin left, locking the door behind her. "For your own protection," she'd said. But Isla knew the truth. She was being hidden. Again. Hours passed. Isla sat on her narrow bed and tried not to think about gray-blue eyes and the way the king had whispered a name his wolf shouldn't have known. Tried not to remember the aching gentleness in his outstretched hand. Tried not to wonder if she'd just made the worst mistake of her life. Garrett found the truth within an hour of speaking to the other servants. The girl's name was Isla. She was a low-ranking maid, assigned to kitchen work and occasional service to visiting nobles. She'd been sent to the king's wing to deliver tea, and according to 3 different servants Garrett had quietly questioned, she'd returned to the servants' quarters in tears, refusing to speak about what had happened. Garrett stood in his private office and considered his options. An Omega servant bonding with the Alpha King. The council would lose their minds. They were already questioning Kaelin's fitness to rule, already murmuring about his refusal to accept a political marriage. If he claimed a servant girl as his mate, they would tear him apart. And Garrett's carefully constructed empire of embezzlement and manipulation would crumble the moment the king gained a competent partner. No, this couldn't happen. Garrett returned to Kaelin's chambers and found the king standing at the window, staring out at nothing. He looked hollowed out, fragile in a way Garrett had never seen. "Perfect." "Your Majesty," Garrett said softly, "I've found the girl." Kaelin spun, hope blazing in his eyes. "Where is she? I need to see her. I need to explain. Her name is Isla." Garrett let the words land like stones. "She's a servant, low-ranking. She works in the kitchens." Kaelin's face went still. "I don't care about her rank. She cares about yours." Garrett moved closer, his voice dropping to a sympathetic murmur. "I spoke with the other servants, Your Majesty, the one she confided in after she fled from you. I'm afraid the news is not what you hope to hear." The king's hands tightened on the window frame. "Tell me." Garrett watched Kaelin flinch and pressed his advantage. "She told the other servants that she would rather die than be claimed by." He paused, as if the words pained him. "By a weak king." Kaelin's wolf howled. The sound was audible even to Garrett, a keening cry of anguish that made the windows rattle. "That's not possible," Kaelin whispered. "She couldn't. The bond. She's requested a formal rejection, Your Majesty." Garrett pulled a folded document from his robes. "The kindest thing you can do is honor her wishes. Set her free. Let her go before this becomes a scandal that—" Kaelin stared at the paper in Garrett's hands. "Rejection." The word tasted like ash in his mouth. His wolf was fracturing, clawing at him, begging him not to do this. But the memory of the terror in Isla's eyes as she'd fled from him was burned into his mind. If she truly wanted freedom from him, who was he to force the bond? "I need to speak with her first," Kalen said, but his voice was already defeated. "She refuses to see you." Garrett's lie was smooth as silk. "She's asked that the rejection be handled quietly, without confrontation. She wants to move on, Your Majesty. And I think, given the circumstances, that's the wisest course for both of you." Kalen took the papers with shaking hands. The rejection rite was simple, ancient, a ceremony that required only 2 witnesses and the Alpha's signature to sever a bond before it was claimed. It was meant to be a mercy, a way to free 2 wolves who'd been mismatched by fate. It felt like execution. She truly said this? Kalen's voice cracked. "That I'm weak?" Garrett's smile was thin. "I'm afraid so, Your Majesty." In the servants' wing, one moment it was there, a golden thread stretched between her heart and something far away, pulling gently, calling her back. The next moment it was gone. Cut, severed so cleanly it left no scar, just an emptiness so vast she couldn't breathe around it. Isla collapsed onto the pile of sheets, the scream that tore from her throat muffled by linen. Her wolf went silent. Not sleeping this time. Just gone. A presence that had been with her for 8 years, suddenly, impossibly absent. He'd rejected her. Isla curled into herself and sobbed into the laundry, her whole body shaking with grief for a bond she'd been too afraid to accept and a mate who'd decided she wasn't worth keeping. Marin found her an hour later, still crying, and understood immediately what had happened. "He rejected you," Marin whispered, kneeling beside Isla. "That bastard actually rejected you." "I ran from him," Isla choked out. "Of course he rejected me. Why would a king want a servant who couldn't even?" "Hush." Marin gathered Isla into her arms, and for the first time in 12 years, since the day Isla's mother died, the girl let herself be held while she broke. 3 months passed. Isla moved through the palace like a ghost. She worked. She slept. She spoke when spoken to. But the light behind her amber eyes had dimmed, and the competence that had made her invaluable to the servants' wing now felt mechanical. Hollow. She never saw the king. She made sure of it. Kalen, for his part, moved through his duties with the same emptiness. He refused every marriage candidate the council presented. He grew thin, more withdrawn. The council whispered that he was unfit to rule, that the kingdom needed a stronger hand. Garrett watched them both with satisfaction. The king was weakening. The servant girl was no longer a threat. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. And then the council made their move, and Garrett saw his opening for something even better than maintaining the status quo. He could break the king entirely. The council chamber smelled of old wood and wolves, barely containing their dominance. Kalen sat at the head of the long table and tried to focus on the words being thrown at him like weapons. "Your Majesty, the kingdom requires stability." Councilman Aldrich's voice was patient in the way that made Kalen's jaw tighten. "Lady Helena of the Northern Reach is an excellent match. Her family's alliance would strengthen our borders, and she's expressed interest in the union." "No." Kalen's response was flat, automatic. He'd said it so many times in the past 3 months that the word had lost all meaning. Then Lady Morgana's niece from the Eastern Pax. "No." Aldrich exchanged a glance with the other council members. The look said everything Kalen already knew. They thought he was broken, unfit, a king who couldn't even manage the most basic duty of securing an heir. They weren't wrong. Garrett stood in the corner, his pale eyes watchful, his expression carefully neutral. He'd been quieter lately, less present. Kalen should have been grateful for the space, but instead it made his wolf uneasy. Something wasn't right. Something hadn't been right since the rejection. Since Isla. Kaelin's hands tightened on the arms of his 3 months, and he still couldn't think her name without feeling the bond scar pull. Without remembering gray eyes and the sound of porcelain shattering and the way she'd looked at him like he was something to run from. Your Majesty. Garrett's voice cut through the council's murmuring. Perhaps a different approach would serve the kingdom better. Everyone turned to look at the head steward. Garrett stepped forward, his movements precise, his smile thin. The lunar festival is in 3 weeks, Garrett said. Traditionally, we host a masquerade ball to honor the moon goddess. I propose we make this year's celebration larger than usual. Invite the noble families from all the surrounding territories. Let them see that our king is strong, focused, and ready to choose a mate from among the finest candidates in the realm. Kaelin's wolf snarled low in his chest. A parade. A spectacle. Exactly what he didn't want. It would demonstrate stability, Aldrich said slowly, warming to the idea, and give you the opportunity to evaluate potential matches in a less formal setting. I'm not interested in a ball. Kaelin's voice came out rougher than he intended. With respect, Your Majesty, what you're interested in is irrelevant. Garrett's tone was gentle, sympathetic, poisonous. The kingdom needs to see that you've moved on from... He paused delicately. From past disappointments, that you're capable of making the choices a king must make. Past disappointments. As if Isla was something Kaelin had tried and discarded, as if the severed bond wasn't still bleeding inside his chest 3 months later. Fine. The word tasted like ash. Plan the ball. Garrett's smile widened. Kaelin waited. Invite the servant who rejected you. Garrett's words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Show her you harbor no ill will. Show the court that her rejection didn't break you. Let her see what she gave up when she chose freedom over a crown. The council members shifted uncomfortably. No one mentioned the servant girl anymore. She'd become a ghost story, the Omega who'd fled from the king's chambers and broken something in him that hadn't healed. Kaelin should have said no, should have told Garrett to go to hell. But the wound was still raw, and the idea of proving he was fine, that he'd moved on, that she hadn't destroyed him. Do it, Kaelin said quietly. Send her an invitation. The formal invitation arrived at Isla's quarters 2 days later, delivered by a palace messenger who wouldn't meet her eyes. The envelope was cream parchment sealed with the royal crest. Her name was written in perfect script across the front. Isla of the servants' wing. Not even worth a family name. She opened it with shaking hands. The words were formal, cold. An invitation to attend a demonstration that past misunderstandings held no lasting consequence. Formal attire required. Attendance optional. Translation: come watch me choose someone worthy. Come see what you lost. Come stand in the corner in whatever shabby dress you can afford while I move on with appropriate partners. The parchment crumpled in Isla's fist. 3 months. 3 months she'd survived with a silent wolf and an emptiness in her chest where the bond used to be. 3 months of avoiding the throne room and the corridors where she might glimpse dark blonde hair and gray-blue eyes. 3 months of pretending she was fine. And now this. Isla didn't realize she was crying until Marin found her sitting on her narrow bed, the invitation clutched against her chest, tears streaming down her face. Child. Marin's voice was soft, devastated. She knelt beside Isla and took the crumpled parchment from her hands. Read it. Her expression hardened into something Isla had never seen before. He wants me to watch, Isla whispered. While he chooses someone else. While he shows the whole court that I meant nothing. No. Marin stood crossed to the corner of Isla's tiny room and moved aside the loose stone that had been hiding a secret for 24 years. Behind it was a small iron key. No, he doesn't get to do this. Not to you. Not anymore. Marin. What? Come with me. Marin led Isla through servant corridors Isla had never seen, downstairs that descended into the oldest part of the palace, until they reached a door that opened into a vault Isla didn't know existed. Inside was a single chest, ancient and sealed with a crest that made Isla's breath catch. The royal seal of the Marin unlocked the chest with trembling hands. Inside were gowns that looked like they'd been woven from starlight, documents bound in ribbon, and a tiara of moonstones that glowed even in the dim light of the vault. "What is this?" Isla breathed. "The truth." Marin lifted the tiara carefully, reverently. "Sit down, child. It's time you knew who you really are." The story came out in quiet, measured words. The Queen's secret pregnancy. The birth witnessed only by Marin and a midwife long since dead. The decision to hide the infant to prevent a succession. The life Isla should have had, stolen before she could even speak. "You're not a servant's bastard," Marin said, her green eyes fierce. "You're the daughter of Queen Alara, the rightful heir to the Starling throne. And that man who thinks he can humiliate you, he doesn't know he's inviting a queen to watch him play at being king." Isla stared at the tiara in Marin's hands, at the proof of a bloodline she'd never known existed, at the documents that would change everything if they ever saw daylight. Her mother had died telling her to stay invisible, to never let them see her, to survive by being nothing. But Isla was tired of being nothing. "He invited me to humiliate me," Isla said slowly. Her wolf, silent for 3 months, shifted, stirred. "He wants me to watch him choose someone else, then show him what he's choosing instead." Marin held out the tiara. "You were born to be a queen, Isla. You don't have to accept his cruelty. Go to that ball and show him, show all of them, exactly who you are." Isla took the tiara. The moonstones were cool against her calloused palms. They felt like a crown, like destiny. Like every choice she'd been too afraid. "I'll need a response card," Isla said quietly. Marin smiled. It was the kind of smile that would have terrified anyone who knew what it meant. Isla wrote a single word on the response card in careful script: attending. The ballroom blazed with candlelight and the scent of 100 wolves dressed in silk and jewels. Music swelled from the orchestra gallery, and nobles danced beneath chandeliers that scattered light like fallen stars. The lunar festival was the social event of the year, and everyone who mattered in the Starling Kingdom had come to watch their king choose a mate. Kaelin stood at the center of it all and felt nothing. Lady Helena was at his elbow, her platinum hair perfect, her ice-blue eyes calculating. She'd been positioned there by the council, a living reminder of what he was supposed to want. Around them, other suitable candidates circled like wolves waiting for an opening. Alphas and betas from noble families, all beautiful, all ambitious, all utterly wrong. His wolf was silent, hollow. It had been that way for 3 months. "Your Majesty, you look distracted," Lady Helena murmured. Her hand rested on his arm with practiced. Kaelin's voice was flat. He scanned the crowd without seeing it, performing the role of a king who had moved on, who was ready to make the practical choice his kingdom needed. It was a lie. Everything about tonight was a lie. Then her scent hit him. Lavender and wild roses, and something that made his wolf explode from dormancy with a violence that nearly drove him to his knees. The broken bond scar in his chest flared to life, not healed but blazing, screaming that she was here. She was close, she was close. She was. Impossible. Every wolf in the ballroom turned toward the entrance as if pulled by an invisible thread, and Isla walked in. Kaelin's vision narrowed to a single point. The woman moving through the doorway wore a gown of pale gold silk that caught the candlelight like dawn breaking over snow. The fabric flowed around her like water, hugging curves he'd never seen beneath servants' gray, before trailing into a train that whispered against marble with every step. Her dark hair was no longer bound in a servant's braid, but arranged in an intricate crown wound with moonstones that glowed against the black. And on her head, impossible and undeniable, sat the late queen's tiara. The court erupted in whispers. Isla moved through the parted crowd with her chin high and her amber eyes blazing. She was transformed. No, not transformed, revealed. This was who she'd always been beneath the invisibility she'd wrapped around herself like armor. Regal. Devastating. A queen wearing her birthright for the first time. Kaelin couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. His wolf was roaring, clawing at his chest, demanding he go to her, claim her, fall at her feet and beg forgiveness for. The bond scar wasn't just flaring. It was burning. Trying to reconnect across the 3 months of silence, reaching for something that should have been his, and wasn't because he'd been a fool. Unmated alphas were already moving toward her. Drawn by her scent, by the unconscious dominance rolling off her in waves, by the simple fact that she was the most breathtaking thing any of them had ever seen. They approached with the reverence usually reserved for royalty, as if they knew something Kaelin was only just beginning to understand. Isla's gaze swept the ballroom and landed on him. For a heartbeat, everything else disappeared. Just the two of them, 3 months and a shattered bond between them, staring at each other across a crowded hall while the world held its breath. Then Isla walked directly toward him. The crowd parted. Lady Helena stepped back, her perfect composure cracking for just a moment as she caught Isla's scent and recognized a superior competitor. The council members went rigid, and Kaelin stood frozen as the woman he'd rejected approached him with the kind of grace that made it clear she wasn't coming to beg. She stopped 3 paces away. Close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her amber eyes. Close enough that her scent wrapped around him like a physical touch. Close enough that the broken bond between them screamed, "Your Majesty." Isla's voice was cool, polite, devastating. "Thank you for the invitation. I wouldn't have missed this for the world." The words landed like a slap. Every noble within earshot heard the ice beneath the courtesy, saw the way their king swayed on his feet as if she'd struck him. Isla held his gaze for one more excruciating second, then turned and walked away, leaving Kaelin standing in the center of the ballroom, utterly destroyed in front of his entire court. A visiting alpha from the northern reach stepped forward immediately, offering Isla his hand for a dance. She accepted with a smile that Kaelin had never seen before. Warm, genuine, nothing like the way she'd looked at him. The alpha led her onto the floor, and other wolves watched with open hunger as she moved through the steps with perfect grace. Kaelin's hands were shaking. His wolf was fracturing, snarling at him to go after her, to fight every male in the room if that's what it took to get her back. But he couldn't move, could only watch as Isla danced with one alpha after another, each one treating her with a deference that made no sense for a servant girl. Unless she wasn't a servant at all. The tiara, the gown, the way she moved through the court like she owned it, the documents Garrett had shown him 3 months ago. Isla's request for rejection, her cruel words about weak kings, all of it felt wrong now, felt like lies. Across the ballroom, half hidden in the shadows near the council's dais, Garrett watched Isla dance and felt his carefully constructed world begin to collapse. That tiara hadn't been worn in over 20 years. It was supposed to be locked in the royal vaults, forgotten, safe. The fact that this girl, this invisible servant girl, was wearing it meant something catastrophic. It meant she wasn't invisible at all. Garrett's mind raced. If Isla's bloodline was what the tiara suggested, if she had documents to prove it, if the king discovered that Garrett had orchestrated the rejection based on lies. Treason. Execution. Everything Garrett had built for a decade, gone. He needed to move quickly. Needed to discredit her before anyone started asking questions about who she really was and why a servant had access to the late queen's regalia. Needed to separate her from Kaelin before the truth came out. The third dance ended. Isla stepped away from her partner, and Kaelin's. He moved through the crowd without conscious thought, his wolf driving him forward. Isla saw him coming and turned toward the balcony doors, but Kaelin was faster. He caught up with her in the moonlit corridor beyond the ballroom, away from the watching court. Wait. His voice came out rougher than he intended. Please. Isla stopped but didn't turn around. Her shoulders were rigid beneath the gold silk, her hands clenched at her sides. Who are you? The question tore out of Kaylin. That tiara. You can't just. Who are you, really? Isla turned slowly. In the moonlight, with the tiara glowing against her dark hair, she looked like something out of legend. A queen from a fairy tale, the mate he'd thrown away because he'd been too broken to fight for her. I'm the woman you rejected without ever asking why she ran, Isla said quietly, and there were tears in her eyes that she refused to let fall. I'm the mate you discarded because your steward told you I found you weak. I'm the queen you never looked closely enough to see. Kaylin's world tilted. Garrett lied. The words he'd said, the rejection Isla had supposedly requested. Lies. I never wanted to reject you, he breathed. Garrett said, you. He told me you wanted freedom, that you called me weak, that. I never spoke to Garrett. Isla's voice broke. I was locked in the servants' wing for 2 days, and then the bond just snapped, and I thought you rejected me because I was just a servant, because I wasn't good enough. The weight of it crushed him. 3 months of grief. 3 months of thinking she'd chosen freedom over him. 3 months of Garrett's lies poisoning everything between them. You're not a servant, Kaylin said. His eyes. Are you? Isla's smile was bitter and beautiful and heartbreaking. No, I'm not. Kaylin reached for Isla before he could stop himself, his hand hovering inches from her face. He wanted to touch her, to prove she was real, to beg forgiveness for believing Garrett's lies. But the way she looked at him, half hope, half devastation, made him freeze. Garrett told me you rejected me, Kaylin said, the words tumbling out desperate and raw. He said you found the bond repulsive, that you told the other servants you'd rather die than be claimed by a weak king. He said you requested the Isla's face went white. I never spoke to Garrett. I was locked in the servants' wing for 2 days. No one told me anything. The bond it snapped, and I thought. Her voice broke. Kaylin's wolf howled. You thought I rejected you, he finished, and the weight of it crushed him. Because you were a servant. Because I was nothing. The tears Isla had been holding back finally spilled over. My mother died telling me to stay invisible, to never let nobles see me or they'd use me and discard me. And then you looked at me like I was everything, and I was so scared, and I ran, and then the bond broke, and I knew I'd been right to be afraid. Kaylin closed the distance between them. Just 1 step. Close enough that he could smell her scent, lavender and wild roses and heartbreak. Close enough that the broken bond between them was screaming to reconnect. I would never have discarded you, he whispered. I spent 3 months trying to understand how I'd failed you so badly that you ran from me. I thought. His hands curled into fists at his sides. I thought I was too weak. You're not weak. Isla's voice was fierce despite the tears. You're the kindest person I've ever known. You learn the servants' names. You intervene when Garrett is cruel. You carry the weight of a kingdom you never wanted, and you do it alone because no one helps you, and... She stopped, looked at him like she was seeing him for the first time. Garrett lied to both of us, she breathed. He wanted us apart. Yes. Kaylin's jaw tightened. And when I find him, I'm going to... Your Majesty. Garrett's voice cut through the night like a blade. They both spun. The head steward stood in the balcony doorway with 6 royal guards behind him. His pale eyes were fixed on Isla, and his expression was carved from ice. Step away from the pretender, Garrett said quietly. Kaylin moved in front of Isla instinctively. She's not a pretender. That tiara was stolen from the royal vaults. Garrett's smile was thin. This woman has committed treason. She is to be arrested immediately and held for trial. On what grounds? Kaylin's voice dropped to an alpha growl. She has every right to. She has no rights. Garrett gestured to the guards. She is a servant girl wearing stolen regalia and making false claims of royal blood to seduce the king. The charges are theft, impersonation of nobility, and attempted treason through deception. The guards moved forward. Kaelin's wolf snarled, pressing against his skin, demanding he shift and protect his mate. But Isla's hand touched his arm, stopping him. "Don't," she whispered. "He's planned this. If you fight the guards, he'll use it against you." She was right. Kaelin could see it in Garrett's eyes. The trap laid and waiting. If Kaelin attacked the guards to protect Isla, he'd be declared unfit to rule. The council would remove him by force. "I'm calling an emergency council session," Garrett said, "immediately. Your Majesty, you will attend. The pretender will be held in the dungeons until we decide her fate." "She's not a pretender," Kaelin said, but his voice was shaking. "And I won't let you." The guards grabbed Isla. Iron shackles closed around her wrists with a sound that made Kaelin's wolf scream. She didn't fight, didn't struggle, just looked at Kaelin with those amber eyes and said, "Prove him, show them you're not weak." Then they dragged her away. Kaelin tried to follow, but Garrett stepped into his path. "The council is waiting, Your Majesty. I suggest you compose yourself before you face them. They're already questioning your fitness to rule. Don't give them more ammunition." The council chamber was cold and smelled of old power. Every seat was filled. Garrett's allies, mostly nobles who owed him favors or feared his influence. Councilman Aldrich stood at the head of the table, his expression grave. "Your Majesty," Aldrich began without preamble, "we've convened to address a crisis that threatens the stability of the kingdom. A servant girl has committed treason by stealing the late queen's regalia and using it to deceive you. The head steward has presented evidence that she intended to seduce you through false claims of royal blood." "She's not lying," Kaelin said. "That tiara wouldn't glow for anyone without royal blood, the magic in it." "The magic in it has faded over 2 decades," Garrett interrupted smoothly. "Any skilled witch could have spelled the stones to glow. This is a con, Your Majesty. And you've been taken in by a pretty face and a clever scheme." "She's my mate." Kaelin's voice rang through the chamber. The bond you rejected 3 months ago." Aldrich's eyebrows rose. "The bond you severed because the girl found you unworthy." Garrett's lies, weaponized and multiplied. Kaelin could see the trap closing around him. "I rejected the bond based on false information," Kaelin said. "Garrett told me she requested the rejection. He lied." The council members exchanged glances. Garrett's expression didn't change. "Your Majesty, these are serious accusations against a loyal servant of the crown," Aldrich said carefully. "But the matter at hand is the pretender's treason. The council has decided to offer you a choice. Reject this woman publicly. Accept Lady Helena's offer of marriage. Produce an heir and stabilize the kingdom. Or—" he paused. "Abdicate the throne to someone strong enough to lead." Silence fell. Kaelin looked around the table and saw the vote had already been taken. They'd decided his fate before he even walked in. "I refuse both options," Kaelin said. "Then we have no choice but to remove you by force, Your Majesty, for the good of the kingdom." "There is one more option." Kaelin's voice cut through the rising murmurs. "Trial by combat, ancient law. I invoke it now. I will fight for my mate's freedom and her claim to the throne." The council erupted. Aldrich raised his hand for silence. "You would invoke trial by combat for a pretender?" Aldrich asked. "A servant girl with no proof of her claims?" "I would invoke it for my mate," Kaelin said. "And if she has documents proving her bloodline, I will fight to ensure she gets the chance to present them. The law is clear. You must accept." Aldrich looked at Garrett. Something passed between them, a calculation, a decision. Then Aldrich nodded slowly. "Very well. Trial by combat at dawn. You will fight our champion. If you win, the pretender goes free and may present whatever evidence she claims to have. If you lose..." Aldrich's smile was cold. The pretender hangs for treason, and you accept the marriage to Lady Helena. Those are the terms. Kaelin's wolf snarled. Accepted. Deep in the palace dungeons, she couldn't hear the ocean of voices above her, couldn't see the moon through the tiny barred window. But she could feel the bond scar in her chest, faint and damaged and struggling to reconnect. And for the first time since the rejection, her wolf stirred. Not loud, not strong, just a whisper in the silence. He's coming for us. Dawn broke cold over the starling palace, the throne room filled with nobles and wolves who'd come to witness either a king's redemption or his final humiliation. The smell of anticipation hung thick in the air, sweat and dominance. Kaelin stood at the center of the combat ring wearing leather armor that left his arms bare. His face was carefully blank, but Isla's wolf could smell the determination rolling off him in waves. He hadn't slept, neither had she. Across from him stood Corin. The enforcer was massive, taller than Kaelin by half a head, shoulders like a bull, with a face marked by dozens of scars from fights he'd won. His eyes were dead, cold, the eyes of a wolf who killed for coin and felt nothing. Garrett stood near the council's dais, his expression calm. Too calm. He'd chosen his champion well, a mercenary with no loyalty to anyone, no reason to hold back. If Corin killed the king in trial by combat, it would be legal, sanctioned, and Isla would hang for treason within the hour. The throne room doors opened. Marin walked in carrying an ancient chest. The crowd parted for her, confusion rippling through the assembly. The head housekeeper was not supposed to be here. This was a royal trial, not a servant's matter. But Marin moved with the kind of authority that made even nobles step aside, and her green eyes were blazing with purpose. "Stop this trial," Marin said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "Before blood is shed, the court must see evidence that changes everything." Garrett's face went white. Just for a moment. Then his mask of calm slid back into place. "The trial has been called," Garrett said smoothly. "It cannot be stopped by. I invoke the right of evidence." Marin's voice was steel. "Ancient law. Before combat begins, new evidence may be presented if it pertains to the accused's identity or status. The law is clear, head steward. Or have..." Councilman Aldrich looked between Marin and Garrett, then nodded slowly. "The right of evidence stands. Present what you have." Marin set the chest on the floor before the council and opened it. Inside were documents bound in faded ribbon, sealed with wax that still bore the royal crest. She lifted them with trembling hands. These documents were sealed by Queen Alara on the day of her death, 24 years ago, witnessed by the council that served her. They prove that the woman you call a pretender is the queen's daughter, the rightful heir to the Starling throne. The throne room erupted. Nobles shouted questions. Council members surged forward to examine the documents. Garrett stood frozen, his pale eyes locked on the chest like it was a weapon aimed at his chest. "Because it was." "Impossible," Aldrich said, but his voice shook. "The queen had no children. We would have known." "The queen was dying," Marin said quietly. "Her advisors feared a succession crisis. An infant queen would have torn the kingdom apart, so they hid the child with me, raised her as a servant, kept her safe until the kingdom was strong enough to accept her." And Elder Thorne, bent with age and half-blind, but his hands were steady as he reached for the documents. He examined the seal with fingers that remembered signing it decades ago. "This is genuine," Thorne said, and his voice silenced the entire throne room. "I witnessed the queen sign this document myself. I was there the night the child was born. The girl is her daughter." Chaos, pure chaos. Half the council demanding proof, the other half shouting for Isla's immediate release. Garrett stood like a statue, and Kaelin could smell the fear finally bleeding through his careful control. "Bring the prisoner," Aldrich commanded. The throne room doors opened again. Isla was led in by 2 guards, her hands still shackled, her gold gown torn and filthy from a night in the dungeons. But she walked with her head high. A queen, even in chains. Her eyes found Kaelin's across the throne room. Everything else disappeared. The shouting nobles. The council's demands. The council's demands. The trial that was supposed to determine her fate. None of it mattered. Just the way she looked at him, exhausted, terrified, and trying so hard to be brave. The woman he'd almost lost because he'd been too broken to fight for her the first time. Not again. The documents changed nothing, Garrett said, and his voice cracked just slightly. Even if her bloodline is legitimate, she has still committed treason by concealing her identity, by stealing from the royal vaults, by attempting to manipulate the king through enough. Kaelin's voice cut through Garrett's lies like a blade. You orchestrated this. You told me she rejected me. You forged the rejection papers. You've been lying to both of us for 3 months. Garrett's smile was thin. Prove it, Your Majesty. I will, Kaelin said. After I win this trial and you're arrested for treason. If you win, Garrett corrected. Corin has killed 12 men in trial combat. You're exhausted, weakened. This fight will be over in minutes, and then the pretender hangs and I remain exactly where I am. The council convened in hushed, urgent conference. Aldrich finally raised his hand for silence. The documents are legitimate, Aldrich announced. The woman known as Isla of the Servants' Wing is confirmed as Isla, daughter of Queen Alara, rightful heir to the Starling throne. However, he paused. The trial by combat will proceed, not to determine her guilt, but to determine if she is worthy of the crown she claims, and if the king is worthy of fighting for her. Isla's chains were removed. She was led to the gallery where the nobles watched, given a seat of honor that she'd never been allowed to occupy in her life. Her wrists were raw and bleeding from the iron shackles. Her gown was ruined, but she sat like a queen and met Kaelin's eyes across the arena. Fight for me, her gaze said. Prove to them what I already know. Kaelin stepped into the combat ring. Corin cracked his knuckles and smiled with all his teeth. For the record, Corin said quietly, I don't care who wins. I get paid either way. But Garrett's paying me extra if you don't walk out of this ring alive. Then you're going to be disappointed, Kaelin said. The fight began. Corin moved fast for a man his size. His first punch would have shattered Kaelin's jaw if it had connected, but Kaelin ducked and drove his fist into the enforcer's ribs. Bone met bone. Corin barely flinched. They circled each other. The crowd's roar faded into background noise. All Kaelin could hear was his own breathing, his wolf snarling for blood, and somewhere above him, Isla's heartbeat racing in time with his own. He was fighting for her freedom, for her throne, for the right to kneel before her and spend the rest of his life earning the bond he'd broken. And he would die before he let Corin take that from him. Corin struck first. His fist caught Kaelin in the ribs with the force of a battering ram, lifting him off his feet and sending him sprawling across the combat ring. The crowd roared. Isla's wolf screamed. Kaelin rolled to his feet, tasting blood. Pain radiated through his chest where bone had cracked, but he couldn't afford to show it. Corin was already moving, a predator who'd learned that hesitation meant death. This was what he'd been paid for, to end this fight quickly and brutally. They circled. The smell of sweat and violence filled the arena. Isla watched from the gallery with her hands still shackled. Her amber eyes locked on Kaelin. He could feel her gaze like a touch against his skin, could smell her fear beneath the lavender and roses. He would not fail her. Not again. Kaelin feinted left, then drove his shoulder into Corin's midsection. The enforcer barely grunted. It was like hitting stone. Corin's elbow came down on Kaelin's spine, driving him to his knees. The marble cracked beneath him. The crowd's noise faded to a dull roar. All Kaelin could hear was his own ragged breathing and Isla's heartbeat racing in time with his. He forced himself upright. Blood dripped from a cut above his eye, blurring his vision. "Stay down," Corin said quietly. "Garrett's paying me triple if you don't get up. Make this easy on yourself." Kaelin's answer was a punch that connected with Corin's jaw. The enforcer's head snapped back. For the first time, surprise flickered across his dead eyes. They fought like wolves, no elegance, no honor, just brutal, desperate violence. Corin was stronger, more experienced, and utterly without mercy. He fought to kill. But Kaelin was fighting for something Corin couldn't understand. The woman watching from above, the mate he'd lost once and refused to lose again. A knee to the stomach, an elbow to the face. Kaelin's vision swam. He could taste copper and feel his wolf clawing to get out, demanding he shift and tear Corin apart with teeth instead of fists. But this fight had to be won as a man, as a king. Corin caught Kaelin's throat and slammed him into the arena wall. Stone cracked. Kaelin's legs went weak. The enforcer's grip tightened, cutting off air, and Kaelin could see the cold calculation in his eyes. How long to hold? How much pressure to apply? The exact moment when a man stopped fighting and started dying. In the gallery, Isla strained against her chains. Her wolf was howling, demanding she shift, demanding she fight. Mate. Ours. Dying. Salen's hand found Corin's wrist. He had seconds before consciousness left him. The crowd was chanting something. He couldn't hear what. His vision was darkening at the edges. He could see Isla through the haze, on her feet now, amber eyes blazing with a fury that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the queen, watching her mate fall. Something inside Kaelin shifted. Not his wolf. Something deeper. The thing that made an alpha more than muscle and dominance. The thing his father had tried to teach him before he died. The voice. Kaelin opened his mouth and let it out. Kunil. The word wasn't shouted, it was commanded. Alpha power rolled through the arena like thunder, and every wolf in the room felt it slam into them with physical force. Corin's grip loosened. Just for a second. Just enough. Kaelin drove his knee into the enforcer's stomach, broke the hold, and followed with a punch that sent Corin staggering backward. The alpha voice was still resonating through Kaelin's chest, through his wolf, through the very stones of the palace. It was the voice of a king who had finally stopped believing he was too weak to lead. Corin recovered fast, but he was off balance now, surprised by the command in Kaelin's voice, by the shift in power. They met in the center of the ring. The fight became savage. Fists and elbows and knees, blood on marble, the sound of bone meeting bone. Isla couldn't look away, couldn't breathe. Her wolf was tearing at her from the inside, desperate to help, helpless in chains. Kaelin took a hit to the jaw that should have ended it, but he stayed on his feet, took another to the ribs that cracked something vital. Kept fighting. Because every blow he took was a promise. I will not abandon you. Every punch he threw was a vow. I will earn you back. Corin was bleeding now too. Breathing hard. The dead look in his eyes had been replaced by something close to respect. This king was supposed to be weak. Broken. An easy victory. Instead, he was fighting like a wolf with everything to lose. Kaelin saw the opening. Corin's left side exposed for half a heartbeat. He took it. Drove his fist into the enforcer's temple with every ounce of strength he had left. Corin went down. The arena went silent. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Corin rolled onto his back, breathing hard, and raised one hand in surrender. Yield, he said, and there was no shame in it, just acknowledgement. The better wolf had won. The court erupted, nobles were on their feet, shouting, cheering, shocked by what they'd just witnessed. Their weak king had just defeated a man who'd killed 12 opponents in trial combat. Kaelin stood in the center of the ring, covered in blood and barely able to stay upright. His eyes found Isla in the gallery. He moved toward her on legs that could barely hold him, climbed the steps to the gallery. The nobles parted for him, He reached Isla, and what he saw in her face broke him all over again. Relief and love and a desperate aching hope that this time, finally, everything might be different. Kaelin fell to his knees in front of her, in front of the entire court, in front of the council that had spent years calling him weak, in front of the kingdom he'd inherited too young and held together through sheer stubborn will. He knelt before his queen and offered her everything he had. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Kaelin said, and his voice carried through the throne room. "I believed lies because I thought I wasn't worthy of you. I rejected you because I thought you wanted freedom. But I see you now, Isla. I see who you are. And if you'll have me, not as your king, but as your mate, your equal, your loyal wolf, I will spend the rest of my life earning the bond I broke." Isla's shackles fell away. A guard moved forward to unlock them, hands shaking. She stepped forward and pulled Kaelin to his feet, her hands gentle. "I don't want you to kneel," she whispered. "I want you to stand beside me." Then she kissed him. The bond snapped back into place with a force that sent shockwaves through every wolf in the throne room. Not broken, not repaired, reforged. The throne room fell silent as the bond settled between them. Every wolf in the hall could feel it, the snap of completion, the rightness of two souls finally aligned. Isla and Kaelin stood in the center of the arena with blood on their skin and tears on their faces, and neither of them could look away. "The claiming must be witnessed," Councilman Aldrich said, and his voice was careful now. Respectful. "By law, before the court." Isla's wolf growled low. "Mine, ours. Claim." She looked at Kaelin, at the cuts on his face and the way he swayed on his feet from exhaustion and pain. He'd just fought for her in front of the entire kingdom, knelt before her and offered everything. The least she could do was give him the same courage. "Then let them witness," Isla said. They moved together without planning it. Kaelin's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing away the tears she hadn't realized were still falling. Isla tilted her head, exposing the curve of her throat. Offering, trusting. "Are you sure?" Kaelin whispered, quiet enough that only she could hear. "Once this is done, there's no going back." "I've been yours since the moment the bond snapped into place," Isla said. "I'm just finally brave enough to show it." Kaelin bent his head to her neck. His breath was warm against her skin, and Isla could smell everything about him. Blood and sweat and the pine smoke scent that had haunted her for 3 months. Her wolf pressed against her ribs, demanding, eager. Then his teeth sank into the soft skin where her neck met her shoulder, and the world went white. The claiming bite was nothing like the bond. The bond had been lightning, sudden and overwhelming. This was fire. It started at the point of contact and spread through her entire body like molten gold, rewriting every cell, every heartbeat, every breath. She could feel Kaelin in her chest, in her bones, could feel his wolf twining with hers, until she couldn't tell where she ended and he began. Mate.complete. Forever. When he released her, his eyes were blazing pale blue-gray, more wolf than man. Blood marked his mouth. The claiming bite on her neck throbbed with heat and magic and perfect, overwhelming rightness. Isla didn't hesitate. She pulled him down and set her teeth to his throat. Kaelin made a sound that was half groan, half growl, and his hands tightened on her waist. The taste of him flooded her mouth, copper and salt, and something wild that made her wolf sing. She could feel the bond solidifying with every second, could feel their scents changing and blending until the court would smell them as a mated pair for the rest of their lives. When she pulled back, matching marks decorated both their necks. The court erupted in acknowledgement howls and cheers, and the undeniable recognition of a bond witnessed and sealed. "Garrett," Isla said, and her voice cut through the noise. "Where is he?" The head steward was trying to slip toward the side exit. 2 guards caught him before he made it 3 steps. They dragged him to the center of the throne room and forced him to his knees. "You have no authority to," Garrett started. I have every authority, Isla said. I am Isla, daughter of Queen Alara, rightful heir to the Starling throne. And you are under arrest for treason, embezzlement, conspiracy, and falsifying a sacred mate bond. Garrett's face went white, then red, then purple with rage. This isn't over, he hissed. You think they'll accept a servant girl as queen? You think the council will let you? The council recognizes Queen Isla's claim, Aldrich interrupted, and every head turned toward him. The documents are legitimate, the blood is verified, and she has just been publicly claimed by the Alpha King. The law is clear. He looked at Isla and bowed. Fully. From the waist, Your Majesty. One by one, the council members followed. Then the nobles. Then the entire court. They were bowing to her. To Isla, the girl who'd spent 24 years invisible. Garrett was dragged away screaming threats and promises. The throne room slowly emptied as nobles filed out, whispering, already spreading the story of what they'd witnessed. The weak king who the 500th proven his strength. The servant queen who the 500th reclaimed her throne. The mate bond that had survived lies, rejection, and 3 months of grief to burn brighter than ever. Finally, only Isla and Kaelin remained. They stood in the center of the throne room, both bleeding, both exhausted, both unable to stop touching each other. Kaelin's hand was on her waist. Isla's fingers were tangled in his hair. The claiming bites on their necks were already starting to scar, marking them permanently as bonded mates. Come with me, Isla whispered. She led him to the royal chambers, not the king's chambers where this had all started, but the queen's. The rooms that had been locked since her mother died, the rooms that were now hers by right. The space was vast and unfamiliar, decorated in silks and moonlight, but none of it mattered. All that mattered was Kaelin beside her, alive and hers. Isla found the basin of water and clean cloth. She made Kaelin sit on the edge of the massive bed while she cleaned the blood from his face, his hands, the deep cut above his eye that would definitely scar. He watched her with those winter sky eyes, and she could feel everything he was feeling through the bond love and relief and bone-deep exhaustion. Garrett told me you rejected me, Kaelin said quietly. He said you found the bond repulsive, that you told the other servants you'd rather die than be claimed by a weak king. Isla's hands stilled. I never said that. I never spoke to anyone about the bond. I know that now. Kaelin caught her wrist, gentle despite his battered hands. But then, I believed him. I thought I was honoring your wishes. I thought signing the rejection was the kindest thing I could do. I thought you rejected me because I was a servant, Isla whispered. I thought the moment you learned I was nothing, you decided I wasn't worth keeping. They sat together in the soft candlelight and finally told each other everything. 3 months of grief and misunderstanding, laid bare. Kaelin's belief that he was too weak to deserve her. Isla's certainty that she was too worthless to be chosen. The lies that had kept them apart, and the truth that had brought them back together. When the words ran out, Kaelin pulled Isla into his lap and held her like she might disappear. She wrapped her arms around his neck and breathed him in, feeling their wolves settle together with perfect contentment. I see you now, Kaelin murmured against her hair. Every part of you. And you're so much more than I ever imagined. Isla pulled back just enough to kiss him. Soft this time. Tender. Not the desperate claiming in the throne room, but something quieter and more certain. A promise that they had forever. The bond hummed between them, complete and unbreakable. Later, they stood on the balcony overlooking the kingdom. Moonlight silvered the palace grounds and the city beyond. Kaelin stood behind Isla with his arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. The claiming bites on their necks were visible to anyone who looked. Proof of their bond, evidence of their choice. We rule together, Isla said softly. Always equals, Kaelin agreed. Below them, the kingdom settled into sleep. Above them, the moon hung full and and between them, the bond that had survived everything finally rested easy. Two wolves, two souls, two rulers who had learned that true strength was found in being seen, and true love was found in choosing to see clearly. 5 years changed everything. The throne room where Isla had once stood in chains, wrists raw and gown torn, now caught the afternoon light like a different room entirely. The heavy curtains had been replaced with pale linen that breathed in the breeze. The council table had been moved closer to the window. And at the head of it, in a chair that sat precisely level with Kaylin's, sat Isla. She was speaking. The council members leaned in when she did, not from courtesy but from habit, from respect earned slowly and completely. The northern districts need the academy model before winter, she said, not after. We don't wait until children are 12 to teach them they matter. No one argued. Not anymore. Kaylin watched her from across the table. He still did that, watched her lead, watched the room bend toward her like sunlight, and felt something settle in his chest that had never existed before her. Pride was too small a word. He had never found a larger one. At their feet, beneath the table, the twins were conducting their own negotiations. Lena had claimed the wool blanket. She sat wrapped in it like a small, very serious sovereign, arranging acorns into a pattern only she understood. She had Kaylin's gray-blue eyes and her mother's absolute certainty. When she decided something, the matter was closed. Finn had other ideas. He tugged the blanket's edge with patient, relentless persistence, his mother's stubbornness wearing his father's gentle face. Steadily. Isla noticed without looking down. Her foot moved, nudging the blanket toward Finn. The negotiation resolved. She never broke her sentence. Marin, seated at Isla's right hand where an advisor belonged, caught Kaylin's eye across the table and said nothing. Her expression said everything. The woman had waited 24 years for this room to look exactly like this. She intended to enjoy every moment. The session ended as the sun began its long afternoon lean. The council filed out. The twins erupted from under the table like something released from a spell, taking the place. They walked in the gardens after. The 4 of them, on the path that wound behind the rosebeds and out through the old orchard. The air smelled of late blossoms and warm earth. Somewhere above the tree line, the moon was already waiting, pale and early in the blue sky. Finn found the claiming marks first. He was riding on Kaylin's shoulders, clinging to his hair, and his small fingers traced the scar on the back of Kaylin's neck with great scientific interest. "What's that?" "A mark," Kaylin said. Lena, walking beside Isla with her hand tucked inside her mother's, looked up. "Mama has one too." "The same one?" "We do," Isla said. "Why?" Isla and Kaylin looked at each other over the children's heads. The whole story lived in that look, the tea tray shattering, the bond severing, the cold words of an invitation designed to wound, the moment she walked into a ballroom and decided to be seen. The blood, the chains, the kneeling, the bite. The look lasted one breath. Then Isla smiled. "We almost lost each other," she said, "because we were both afraid to be seen. But love is braver than fear, so we chose to be brave." Finn considered this. "But worth it," Isla finished. The boy seemed satisfied. He went back to destroying Kaylin's hair. Lena leaned her head against Isla's arm, and Isla pressed a kiss to the top of her daughter's head, and the 4 of them kept walking as the moon grew brighter in the cooling sky. Her wolf pressed warm against her ribs. Content. Home. Isla had spent her whole life making herself invisible. She had learned to vanish so well that she almost disappeared entirely. She had been seen, in the end, by the one person who needed to find her. She didn't hide anymore. Thank you so much for staying with this story all the way to the end. If Isla and Kaylin found their way into your heart, let me know in the comments. I read every single one. If you want more stories like this one, make sure you're following so you never miss the next one. There are more hidden queens, stubborn kings, and fated bonds waiting for you. I'll see you in the next one.